that wrong? No, as when you think.
It began with the sound of bells, soft, distant, and wrong. The villagers of Windermere said they hadn't heard them in years, not since the great storm took the steeple from Harrowick House. But the boy had heard them just once, carried faintly through the fog that curled down the moors. A rusted chime, a single tone rising above the heather. And once heard, it could not be forgotten. That sound, old and sorrowful, was a key in the lock of something sealed too long. Those who heard it again would come to regret it. I'm Iris Thorne, your voice in the silence. Stay with me. The night has a story to tell. In the year 1869, the manor known as Harrowick House stood lonely atop the ash-gray cliffs of Windermere, its western wing half sunken into the earth from years of coastal erosion. The estate was built in the late 1600s by Elspeth Harrowick, the widow of a naval captain who vanished on his third voyage to the Horn of Africa. It was said she commissioned the house as both memorial and mausoleum, refusing to acknowledge her husband's death. Her grief became a legend, a curse in some retellings. Children whispered that her soul had never left the house. Some even said she built the belfry not to call to the heavens, but to keep the dead from returning through the sea caves below. The house passed through generations of Harrowicks, each with fewer heirs than the last, until the final resident, Lord Edric Harrowick, disappeared without explanation in 1827. After that, the manor was shuttered, sealed behind iron-bound doors and sea-salted stone. Ivy overtook the walls, and salt winds burned away the last of the old paint until it stood raw and skeletal, crowned in silence. For over 40 years it remained untouched, save by the elements, until Miss Calla Fenworth arrived by train from London in the spring of 1869. Calla was 27, recently widowed, and of precarious means. Her husband, an amateur naturalist and collector of antiquities, had perished during an ill-fated expedition to the Hebrides. His debts were quietly absorbed by her late father's dwindling estate, and though she wore mourning, she did not mourn. She had known Charles Fenworth for only a year before their wedding and another before his death, and in truth, she had loved him only as one might love a book left open on the shelf, its story promised but unread. When she received a letter sealed in black wax bearing the Harrowick crest, she nearly discarded it unread. Only the strangeness of the thing compelled her to open it. The letter was brief, handwritten in spidery script. You are the last known kin of the Harrowick line. The house is yours, should you claim it. Come swiftly before the bells toll again. It was unsigned. Calla brought it to her solicitor, who confirmed its legitimacy after several weeks of inquiry. Her grandmother, it seemed, had been a Harrowick by birth, a fact quietly erased after her elopement with a poet. Calla had never met the woman, but now found herself heiress to a sprawling, haunted ruin on the northern coast. The solicitor suggested selling the estate outright, warning that upkeep would be monstrous and value minimal. But Calla did not sell. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the cold arithmetic of a future without fortune. Or perhaps, deep within, it was the same hunger that had lived in her husband's eyes whenever he spoke of ancient things best left buried. Whatever the reason, she boarded the train to Windermere on the last day of April, with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, and a dog-eared copy of The Mysteries of Udolpho in her coat pocket. The station was little more than a platform beside a stone marker. A single carriage awaited her, drawn by an iron-gray horse and driven by an old man in a wide-brimmed hat who did not speak. He took her trunk with a nod and offered her a gloved hand. They rode in silence through the village, which was more like a scattering of cottages than a proper town, and the heads of children turned as she passed. The house revealed itself slowly, rising from the mist like a phantom ship. Even in its ruin, Harrowick House had presence, its silhouette jagged and noble, the central tower still intact, the windows like blind eyes. Calla felt a chill despite herself. As the carriage pulled into the overgrown circle drive, a pair of wrought iron gates creaked open without aid. The housekeeper was waiting at the door. Her name was Mrs. Thorne, no relation to Iris Thorne, though the coincidence would later strike Calla as peculiar. Mrs. Thorne was tall, nearly skeletal, with the posture of a woman who had forgotten how to sit. She welcomed Calla with a curt nod and a rasping voice, then turned without ceremony to lead her inside. The interior smelled of cedar and dust. White sheets cloaked the furniture like ghosts in mid-sentence. High ceilings, arched doorways, a grand staircase whose banister bore carvings of sea serpents and thorned roses. Mrs. Thorne led her past drawing rooms and parlors, through a narrow hall with warped floorboards, and up a second stairwell that wound like a shell. At the top, she unlocked a door with an iron key and gestured inward. "This will be your chamber," she said. "It has the least drafts." "Thank you," Calla said, stepping inside. The room was modest by the house's standards, with a canopied bed, a writing desk, and a high window facing the sea. The wallpaper was faded damask, and the fireplace still held the charred remains of a last fire. On the nightstand lay a journal bound in cracked leather. Calla reached for it, but Mrs. Thorne's voice halted her. "It belonged to your great-uncle, Lord Edric. Best leave it be until you've settled." "I thought he vanished." "He did," Mrs. Thorne said, and turned away. In the days that followed, Calla explored the house with cautious fascination. Most doors remained locked, and Mrs. Thorne held the only ring of keys. When Calla inquired, the old woman would only say, "Rooms forget how to be used if left too long." Still, Calla mapped what she could, charting drawing rooms and abandoned studies, the crumbling library, the dining hall with its long table covered in dust. She found portraits draped in linen, some with corners exposed, solemn faces, watchful eyes. At night, the wind scraped the walls like fingernails. Once, she thought she heard a bell, a single chime, low and resonant. When she asked Mrs. Thorne, the housekeeper only said, "The sea plays tricks with its own music." But Calla was not convinced. One afternoon, while dusting the library shelves herself, Mrs. Thorne refused to touch the books. She found a hidden panel behind a row of volumes. Inside was a narrow passage, barely wide enough to walk, leading downward in a slow spiral. The air was cool and smelled of brine. She descended with a candle, following the path until it opened into a room with stone walls and rusted chains. At the center stood a bell, ancient, iron, and unstruck. Its clapper was missing. Calla felt something in her chest, like memory or premonition. She touched the bell's rim. It was warm. When she returned upstairs, the journal was gone from her nightstand. and in its place, an iron key. The key was old, its iron bow ornate with thistlework, its shaft twisted as though it had once been heated and turned by hand. It lay precisely in the place where the journal had been, not haphazardly, not misplaced, but placed as though by intention. For a long moment, Calla did not touch it. She stood still in the gloom of her room, the fire barely kindling in the hearth, and listened. Nothing but the far-off wind and the slow tick of the mantel clock. Then, with careful fingers, she lifted the key. It was heavier than expected and left a faint rust print on her palm. That night, she dreamed of the bell, not as it had stood, silent and clapperless in the undercroft, but as it might have once been, upright in a tower, wreathed in ivy, its tolls slow and mournful, ringing through thick fog to a shore strewn with salt-white bones. In the dream, she climbed the stairs toward it, each step turning to sand behind her. She reached the belfry and touched the bell, and from within it came a breath, a woman's breath. And then a voice she did not know whispering her name. When she awoke, she found a line of sea salt across the threshold of her chamber. The next morning, Calla confronted Mrs. Thorne. She found the housekeeper in the West Hall, tending to a vase of dry flowers that had likely been dead for years. "You came into my room," Calla said. "You took the journal and left the key." Mrs. Thorne did not look up. "I enter no room uninvited." "Then who did?" The housekeeper's hands paused, knotted with age. "The house keeps its own counsel." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you'll get," she said, and turned away, her shawl dragging like a widow's veil down the hall. Calla stood still for a long time before returning to her room. She placed the key in the drawer of her writing desk, locked it, and resolved to return to the bell, only in daylight. But the house had other plans. In the following days, she began to notice small changes, shifts in the furniture, portraits with faces she didn't recognize, doors that were closed now open, and rooms colder than the rest as though holding their breath. One morning, her traveling coat was missing. Another, she found a child's shoe on the stair, and always, faintly, behind the wind and the groan of the old timbers, there was the sense of music. Not melody, not even harmony, just resonance, as though the walls remembered the tone of bells and hummed it back in silence. She began to write in earnest. Not letters, there was no one to write to, but entries, observations, notations of time and place, small details to orient herself against the slow drift of the house. She found herself walking the halls with purpose, trying doors, listening for echoes. The iron key opened none of the doors upstairs, nor those to the tower, nor the locked study on the first floor. She carried it on a chain around her neck all the same. On the 10th night, she found a stair behind the hearth in the dining room. The fire had gone out, and the ash was cold. As she swept it, the grate shifted. Beneath it lay a small lever set into the stone. When pulled, it groaned, and a portion of the fireplace wall slid inward to reveal a narrow stone stair. This was no servant's corridor. It led not upward, but down into the cliffs. She lit a lantern and descended, the stair curving in a slow spiral like the one beneath the library. But this one descended far deeper until the air grew damp and tasted of iron. At last, she reached a threshold, an archway into a domed chamber with walls of black stone. Here were carvings, sigils not in any language she knew, marks like twisted alphabets or the crawl of vines and frost. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on it, a silver bowl filled with water that did not ripple despite the breath of the sea. She leaned forward. Her reflection looked back, but changed. Pale, older, eyes shadowed, and behind her, in the water's image only, stood a figure, a woman, tall and shrouded, with long white hair and hands clasped in mourning. She did not move, but her presence was as loud as thunder. Calla turned. No one stood there. The chamber was empty. She fled up the stairs, the lantern guttering. When she reached her room, her journal lay open on the bed. 3 words had been written there, words in her own hand, but not her memory. Ring the bell. She did not sleep that night. On the morning of May 13th, the fog rolled in thicker than ever before. Mrs. Thorne did not appear at breakfast. The bell tower, long inaccessible, seemed clearer through the haze, as though nearer than before. Calla took the key from around her neck and descended again to the undercroft, the place where the bell waited. This time, the air was warmer. The chains around the bell had fallen away, rusted through, and the clapper, missing before, now hung in place. Black iron, like a pendulum held at rest. She stepped forward. Voices echoed faintly from the stone. Fragments of the past, she thought. Prayers, sobs, laughter. Something sung, and above it all, the hum of potential. The bell longed to be rung. She could feel it, like static against her skin. She reached for the rope, its fibers slick with damp. And then, her fingers stopped. A noise, not from the bell, but from behind. Footsteps, bare, light, childlike. She turned, lantern held high. The passage was empty, but the salt line at the threshold had been broken. Calla fled again, this time through the south corridor, up into the tower proper. The key, her last resort, burned cold against her chest. She tried it in every door. At the top of the stairs, she found a single oak door with no knob. The key slid in with ease and turned with a click. Inside was a belfry long lost to rot and silence. The roof was broken, and gulls wheeled overhead. The sea lay in the distance, steel gray and endless. The bell stood here too, not a second bell, but the same one. She looked back down the stairs. Nothing. Looked again. Still nothing. And then behind her, the bell tolled. Not by rope, not by hand. It tolled once, deep and slow, and the sound passed through her body like a wave of grief. And from below, screams. Mrs. Thorne's voice, followed by silence. Calla rushed down the stairs, nearly tripping, lantern swinging. She found the dining room empty, the hearth dark, the secret stair sealed. She searched the entire house. Mrs. Thorne was nowhere to be found. Only later would she notice the second name engraved on the bell's rim, beneath Elsbeth's, barely legible. It read, Calla Fenworth. The house was changing. Calla could feel it in the floors, in the air between the window panes, in the way the shadows now slithered to their corners when she passed. She spent the morning writing, trying to make sense of the name carved beside Elspeth's. Her name, scrawled in metal older than she could explain. It wasn't just the absurdity of its presence that chilled her, but the style in which it had been engraved. The letters bore serifs, sharp as blades, unmistakably hand-cut, not recent. As if it had always been there, waiting for her to arrive and notice it. She tried to reason through it. Coincidence, hallucination, a family ancestor she hadn't known. But she had no known ancestors named Fenworth. Calla was the only child of scholars, both long deceased, and there was nothing about Harrowick House or the Bell of Elsbeth in any of the books they'd left behind. She pulled every family ledger she could find in the study, scoured the names of tenants, servants, prior owners. Some pages had been torn out, others were ruined with water damage or eaten away by time. And again, the same redacted phrase appeared, entire paragraphs rendered illegible by a thick blot of black ink. But if she squinted under the light and traced the grooves of the pen, she could discern a pattern. 3 words, repeatedly obscured. Calla is chosen. She sat back from the desk, breath shallow. This was not how it worked. A historian reconstructed, interpreted, preserved. But Harrowick was reconstructing her. She went back to the belfry that afternoon. The gulls were gone, and though the sky remained overcast, it no longer rained. The salt wind had lost its bite. In the corners of the tower, lichens bloomed in strange floral shapes she did not recognize. Spirals, eyes, thorned petals. The bell no longer stood there. Only the iron hook where it had once been tethered, and the floor where its base had scarred the stone. She touched the mark. It was warm. That night, she was visited. It began with whispers drifting from the far end of the corridor outside her room. Not words, tones, as if someone was speaking in reverse. She opened the door and stood in the dark, waiting. The whispering stopped. Then, behind her, the sound of a footfall. She spun. Nothing. But on the desk, her journal was open to a blank page. The words bled through in black ink, letter by letter, written by no hand she could see. It rings again. She ran. Not from the house. She knew by now that Harrowick did not permit such things without consent, but to the Undercroft. This time, the air was still. The bell was gone here as well. In its place stood a woman. She was barefoot, her white hair tangled with salt and dust, her eyes the same gray as the sea. Her skin bore the pallor of moonlight, and her gown was soaked at the hem as if she had walked from deep water. Her face was neither young nor old, only ancient in the way that cliff faces or driftwood become, etched with time, expressionless in stillness. Calla could not move. The woman raised one hand and pointed toward the iron ring that had once held the bell. "You've rung it," she said, and her voice was the tolling of a bell slowed to speech. "And now the house will listen." "I didn't," Calla managed to whisper. "It rang itself." The woman smiled faintly, as though amused. "It always rings itself, but it is your hand that brings it. Who are you?" "I am the Watcher, the one who waits for the chosen." "I'm not chosen. I'm just here to write about it." "Then write," the woman said, stepping back into the shadow. "But what you write will write you back." The flame in her lantern extinguished. When she lit it again, the chamber was empty. The hook above her was rusted and unused, the stone cold, and in her hand was the key again, slick with salt water. She climbed back into the house and found her room untouched. Mrs. Thorne was still missing. The bells were silent until midnight. That was when the house began to dream. It started with the chiming of the clocks. All of them, in every hallway, stairwell, and chamber, chimed 13. The tone was not the familiar chime of brass, but the toll of iron, deep, dissonant. The air bent around the sound. And then the walls began to speak. They murmured stories in half-heard voices, memories of laughter, weeping, arguments in rooms that no longer existed. Footsteps echoed in places Calla knew to be sealed. The portraits along the south gallery turned their heads to follow her, and each window revealed a different sky. Storm, night, starlight, fire. She stumbled through the library and collapsed against the hearth. And there, again, was the journal. This time, the ink was already dry. The page read, "Welcome to the echoing." She did not sleep. She remained in the chair until dawn. When morning came, the house was quiet again. The clocks ticked normally. The walls did not murmur. The windows showed only sea and fog. But the salt line had returned to her door, and beneath it, a set of footprints, small, bare, wet, leading away toward the southern wing. She followed them. They led her through a part of the house she had never entered, an old nursery sealed behind an iron latch. Inside were 5 cribs, each empty. Toys sat on a shelf above a cold stove. A carousel horse hung from the ceiling by rusted chains. The footprints ended beneath the rocking chair in the corner. There, hidden beneath the floorboard, she found a letter. It was addressed to no one, unsigned, the paper yellowed and thin. The ink was faded, but legible. To those who follow, the bell tolls only for the remembering. When the house forgets, the chosen are sent. We are the voice, not the bell. We keep the tone alive. Ring once and wake the memory. Ring twice and be seen. Ring 3 times and you belong to it. Do not ring a 4th. There is no 4th. She sat on the floor for a long time, the letter in her lap. Outside the window, fog wreathed the cliffs. That evening, she found a second key in the pocket of her coat. It was smaller than the first, made of bone, not metal. On its bow was engraved a simple shape, a bell, cracked through its center. She turned it over once in her palm, and when she looked up, the house was different again. The stair behind her was gone. The hall she'd entered from sealed with wall. She was no longer in the nursery. She was in the tower again. And this time, the bell was tolling. The sound reverberated through bone, not ears, not the air. It pulsed directly through Calla's marrow, low and impossibly slow. One toll, then another. And after the third, silence, but not the ordinary kind. The silence of Harrowick Tower now was deeper than absence, a hush so thick she could feel it pressing against her tongue, refusing sound to form. She looked around. The tower was no longer in ruin. The floor had been restored, the stone free of moss or lichen. Oil lamps flickered from sconces where cobwebs had clung. A bronze railing enclosed the upper circle, gleaming as if newly polished. Outside the windows, the sea had vanished. In its place was a wide moor, violet under the light of an unfamiliar moon. Someone else was standing across the chamber. Not the spectral woman of the Undercroft. This figure was tall, male, and unmistakably living. He was dressed in a style at least a century outdated. Broad shoulders beneath a wool greatcoat, high collar, hair swept back from a narrow, drawn face. He stood with his hands behind his back, gazing toward the moor. Calla took a step forward. He did not turn. "You've come sooner than expected. Who are you?" The man exhaled a breath he had apparently been holding. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you've heard it now." "The bell?" He turned to face her. His eyes were pale, glassy blue, as if he rarely blinked. "The memory," he said. "The bell is only a door. Sound is the first form of memory. It was always about what we remember and what we must agree to forget." Calla shook her head. "I don't understand." "You will. You must. Because you're not the first to come to Harrowick like this, and you won't be the last. I came to write a history." That's exactly what they wanted. Who? The ones who built the bell, not the house. The bell came before, long before. Harrowick grew around it. like a shell around a pearl or a tumor. He walked toward the window and gestured outside. The moor was changing. Shapes were moving beneath the heather, vast and slow, something ancient and restless. They called it a signal, a harmonic passage, a mnemonic chamber. All of it is true, but the bell's deepest function was not to toll, it was to bind. Certain memories were never meant to fade. Others were never meant to surface. He glanced at her. "Which are you here for?" Calla opened her mouth but couldn't answer. She no longer knew. She was drawn to the place, yes, but by whom? Or by what? The man continued. Elsbeth was the first to break the bond. She rang the fourth toll. Calla stiffened. The letter said not to, and yet she did. What happened to her? She's still here, he said softly. Somewhere inside, not as you or I are, but she remains. He reached into his coat and removed a small book. The cover was leather, bound in crimson thread. I wrote this before I vanished, he said. My name is not in it, nor yours, but it will show you what's next. Calla took the book. It was cold in her hands. When she looked up, he was gone, and so was the tower. She stood in her bedroom again. The lamps were unlit. Rain lashed the windows. The wind screamed through the chimney like a voice. She opened the book. The first page bore a single phrase. This is not the first life you've lived in Harrowick. She flipped to the next page. A date, written in faded ink, March 2nd, 1816. A journal entry followed, elegant script, sharply slanted. She arrived in fog, the woman with salt-tangled hair and eyes full of flame. She asked for the bell. I told her we'd silenced it long ago, but that was a lie. It still rings in the deep, beneath the floorboards of this house, where the dead keep their stories folded into stone. She will find it. They always do. And then I will forget again and begin this record anew until someone remembers. The next entry was from 1839, then 1871, then 1905. Always the same voice, always recounting a woman arriving, searching, awakening the bell, and always ending with a phrase. And then I forgot again. Calla turned to the final page. Blank. She closed the book and stared into the fireless hearth. The past wasn't behind her. It was recursive. Harrowick was not merely haunted. It was looping, retelling the same story in endless iterations until someone remembered long enough to break the pattern. And now the name carved in the undercroft, her name, made sense. Not from this life, but from another. A sound drifted down the corridor. Not the bell, a piano. She followed it, through the hall, down the main staircase, past the parlor. It came from the east wing, the music room, which she had never opened. The door was ajar. Inside, the room was dim. A grand piano sat in the corner, keys depressed by no visible hand. The melody was slow, mournful, something old. She entered, drawn by the music. The fire in the grate flared to life, and by its light, she saw a portrait above the mantel, a woman in a black gown, hair bound in a ribbon, staring with eyes full of ice. Calla walked closer. It was her own face. She turned, heart pounding. The room was empty, except the piano had stopped, and on the keys lay a dried, withered flower, a belladonna blossom. She stepped backward, breath quick. Her reflection in the window shimmered, and for a moment, the face that looked back at her was not her own, but that of the pale woman from the undercroft, eyes black with sea-deep sorrow. Calla fled the room, back to the west wing, past the sealed nursery, through the library. The portraits watched. The clocks had stopped. She found the belfry door unlocked. At its center, the bell hung again, whole, polished. The tower stood open to the night, but no wind stirred. She approached the bell and reached up not to ring it, but to touch its side. It sang. Not with sound, but sensation. Visions. Lives lived across centuries, all her own. Again and again, Calla Fenworth returning to Harrowick House, called by the bell, seeking the truth, failing to escape. Each iteration ended the same. A ringing, a vanishing, a forgetting. This time, something was different. She was further. She had remembered more. She had read the book. She stepped away and looked toward the hook where it had once been removed. Someone had carved into the wood beside it, "To break the ring, be silent." She returned to her room and sat with her journal. And for the first time since arriving, she did not write. She closed the journal. She slept, and in her dreams, no bells tolled. But in the walls of Harrowick, others began to stir. Dawn never quite arrived at Harrowick. Morning was a paler shade of midnight, a sky bruised rather than lightened. The lamps dimmed on their own, but the sun never truly showed itself. Calla awoke not to bird song or light, but to silence, thick, almost conscious, like something waiting. The journal she had refused to write in still sat beside her, undisturbed, but the little crimson volume the man had given her was gone. In its place, a single feather, gray and curled. She turned it in her fingers and thought of the bell's warning, "To break the ring, be silent," and realized that in every telling she had read, every past iteration of herself had failed, not because they rang the bell, but because they always tried to speak, to write, to record, to remember. That was the trap. The bell did not want to be known. It was designed to compel memory, then erase it, each record becoming a chain that bound the teller to Harrowick once again. But she hadn't written. Not yet. She dressed and left her room. The house was still. Dust lay untouched on the banisters. The east wing door, where she had heard the piano the night before, was now sealed shut again, nailed in places she did not recognize. No sign of the music, no trace of the belladonna flower. She stepped carefully through the halls, each step quieter than the last, until even the floor ceased to creak. At the far end of the corridor, a door she hadn't noticed before was ajar. It led to a stairwell descending beneath the manor, far below the undercroft she had previously explored. This stair spiraled deeper, carved not of stone, but of black wood, slick with age. As she descended, the air grew colder, the silence more absolute. At the bottom, she entered a chamber without corners. It was circular, vast, and domed, lined with books, but not ordinary volumes. These were carved into the wall itself, etched into the stone, words layered on words, stories overlapping. And in the center stood a lectern. Upon it rested a single object, her own journal. But it was no longer blank. The pages fluttered open by themselves, turning rapidly, faster and faster, until they stopped on a single phrase scrawled in ink that gleamed like oil. "You have always told the story." Calla backed away. The dome began to vibrate. Low at first, like a hum. Then the hum resolved into a rhythm, a heartbeat, her heartbeat. The bell was not a device. It was not even truly a sound. It was her. She was the resonance. Harrowick did not create the memory loop. It echoed her. A figure appeared on the edge of the room, cloaked in gauze, faceless. It gestured to the journal. Calla whispered, "I won't write it." The figure tilted its head. It seemed neither pleased nor displeased, only watching, waiting. She turned and fled back up the stairs, but they no longer led to the same place. She emerged in the nursery, though she had entered from the cellar. The room was unchanged from before, dusty, forgotten, but now a cradle in the corner rocked. She approached it slowly. Inside was a doll with no face, its hands folded over a slip of paper. She unfolded it, a drawing, crude, childlike. It showed a tower, a woman, and the bell, but the woman had no eyes, just black smears inked over again and again. Lightning flashed, revealing her own reflection in the nursery window. Her eyes had begun to dim, to lose their color, the price of resisting, of not recording. The bell punished silence too, in its own way, but her conviction held. She tore the paper and dropped the pieces. "Not this time," she said aloud. "I won't be the archivist of my own cage." At that moment, a creaking sounded behind her. The armoire she had left closed now stood open, and inside, a staircase. Narrow, steep, climbing into impossible darkness. A new path. A chance, perhaps, to ascend beyond the cycle. She took it. The steps groaned but held. The walls tightened, and soon she had to crawl, feeling her way through the dark, the only sound her breath and the ever-present thrum beneath her skin. At last, a hatch above her. She pushed, and it opened into the bell tower, but not as it had been. Now it was vast, impossibly tall, the bells suspended above like a moon, glowing with unread script. And she was not alone. Surrounding the chamber stood dozens of figures, each silent, each holding a journal. Some looked like her, others like no one she'd ever seen. Past lives, other tellers, fractured selves. They turned in unison toward her. One stepped forward and held out a hand. Calla stared at it, then placed her hand in theirs. The bell above shimmered, and for the first time in any telling, it began to dissolve. Its metal became mist. Its tolling ceased, not silenced, but undone. Memory unwound like thread. The walls of the tower faded. She stood in the empty moor again, alone, barefoot. A voice, not her own, echoed, "You have remembered enough to forget. Now walk forward." And so she did. The moor stretched endless and flat before her, but each step Calla took shifted the ground subtly beneath her feet. She no longer heard the bell, not in the air, not even in the bone memory that had lingered since she first stepped through Harrowick's gate. A new silence enfolded her, not thick or ominous, but clear, like the hush after snowfall. With every step forward, she could feel the bell's influence fading. Not gone, never gone, but quieter, less insistent. It was not vanquished. It had simply loosened its grip. She was walking beyond its reach, or perhaps she had changed its shape. Around her, the sky was an old parchment gray, brushed with soft blues. Ahead, a structure emerged from the mist, a ruin of stone, low to the ground, ringed with wooden beams carved in unfamiliar runes. It was not Harrowick, but it hummed with the same gravity. She entered cautiously. Inside was a circle of stones, and in the center, a hearth. Cold, unlit. She sat before it and waited. She didn't know why, only that she must. The wind outside stirred, then calmed. Minutes passed, then hours. Then time became something other than time. Shadows moved but never grew longer. At last, another figure arrived. A woman, older, dressed in heavy robes stitched with bells that did not ring. Her face was kind and unfamiliar, and yet Calla recognized her. Not as a memory, but as an inheritance. "You came far," the woman said. "I left the house," Calla replied. "I heard the bell, but I didn't write." "You did," the woman said, "just not in ink." Calla looked at her hands, empty now. "Was it ever real?" Oh, it was always real, but it was never meant to be permanent. They spoke no more. The woman handed her a branch, gnarled, blackened, but with a living root. "Plant this," she said. Calla looked around. "Here?" Number where the house was. The ruin faded. The woman vanished. Calla stood once more on the moor, but the air smelled different, warmer, more alive. She walked until the land shifted again beneath her feet, and she stood in the clearing where Harrowick House had been. Nothing remained. No tower. No steps. Only a circle of earth, ringed with white stones like teeth. She bent and planted the branch in the center. The ground accepted it without resistance. From the moment her fingers left the bark, the wind changed. A low tone filled the air. Not the bell, but something like it. A tone in a different key, a new resonance. The earth trembled gently. The branch took root. And then, from that slender form, leaves began to bloom. Each one bore a symbol. Each one was a page. Calla understood then. This was the story, not the house, not the bell, but what she had done to change it. Not escape, but transformation. The cycle was not broken, it had evolved. Behind her, voices murmured. She turned and saw them, the others who had been trapped. They stood at the edge of the clearing, watching in silence. Some wept, some simply breathed. And then, one by one, they turned and walked away into their own futures, their own stories. None looked back. Calla remained. She sat before the sapling and watched it grow. Hours passed, then days. She knew she would not stay forever. But for now, she kept vigil. One morning, if it could be called morning, a traveler arrived. A young woman with a satchel and a familiar look of exhaustion. She paused at the edge of the clearing, uncertain. Calla rose and walked to meet her. "You're not from here," the traveler said. "No one is," Calla replied. "What did you come looking for?" "A place I read about," she said. "A house, a bell, a story that keeps telling itself." Calla smiled gently. "You found it, but it's changing." "Can I write it down?" "Yes," she said, "but only if you're ready to lose the ending." The traveler looked uncertain. Calla nodded. "It's all right. Just walk with me. I'll tell you what I remember." And so they walked together. The tree grew behind them, leaves shivering in a wind that carried no bell, only the echo of stories once told, and those still waiting. Far away, in a library that no longer held any record of Harrowick House, a page turned itself in an otherwise forgotten book. Its title faded as soon as it was read. Its contents changed each time it was opened. But in the right light, at the right hour, a curious reader might still catch the faint scent of belladonna ink and hear, just for a moment, the sound of wind chimes across an empty moor. It was not a place that could be found on maps, and yet there were those who continued to search for Harrowick. Decades passed, generations turned over. Old scholars whispered of a manor where time refracted, where ink and voice wove a prison of memory. Some believed it a metaphor, others sought it like a pilgrimage. Most never returned, but a few did, and they brought with them not answers, but changes. A botanist published an obscure monograph on a bell-shaped flower that bloomed only in shadow. A composer released an album of tones never before recorded by instrument or voice, tones that seemed to summon dreams of stone towers and hollow bells. A child in a forgotten village began to draw complex sigils in dust, circles within circles, silent bells at the center. None of them had been to Harrowick, and yet each had touched it or been touched by it. The house, though gone, still resonated through memory, through myth, through story. In one such story, Calla became a ghost. In another, she was a tree. In yet another, she never existed at all, but was dreamed into being by the house itself. But in the version that mattered most, she remained flesh, changed but alive, wandering not to escape the bell, but to understand it. She crossed country borders, often unnoticed, sometimes invited. She wrote nothing, published nothing, and yet in her wake, strange libraries bloomed. Small, hidden reading rooms appeared in cities that had forgotten them, each one with no staff, no record, only a single shelf that bore the name Archives of the Unrung. Within those shelves, handwritten accounts, drawings, records that defied chronology or logic. They weren't hers, and yet they were. Calla's presence was fleeting. She slept in abandoned bell towers, in disused belfries above silent churches, always waking before first light. The world had grown louder, but she heard beneath the noise. She had learned to recognize those touched by the house, a flicker in their eye, a cadence in their voice, a tension in the hands just before they wrote. To these, she would sometimes speak. Never directly, but in parable. She would offer them a seed, sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical, and tell them, plant it. But not where anything grows, only where something was forgotten. Some did, others did not. But where they did, new sounds began to bloom. In a small town where no bell had tolled for 100 years, a church's bell tower began to chime without cause. The bell had long since been removed, yet the sound persisted. Investigations revealed nothing. Priests spoke of miracles. Musicians wrote sonatas inspired by the tone, only to find themselves haunted by half-finished compositions. In every case, the same seed was found, buried in odd places, beneath typewriters, behind mirrors, inside the seams of old coats. One librarian found hers between the pages of a lost journal, one that bore the faint imprint of a name, C. Vellum. No one knew who she was. No one could find a birth record. And yet the name appeared in footnotes, in margins, in the metadata of broken files stored on forgotten servers. In the mountains, a convent of silent nuns maintained a bell that could not be rung. They called it the last sound. Visitors reported strange dreams upon entering their grounds, dreams of winding staircases, white feathers, and a lullaby hummed in reverse. When asked, the sisters only smiled and placed a finger to their lips. They were keepers of the pause, they said. The breath before the bell, the memory before the writing, the silence where transformation begins. Elsewhere, a playwright staged a work with no script. The audience sat in a room filled with mirrors, while a single actress wept without words. At the end of the performance, each viewer received a folded note with their own handwriting, dated the following day. Most dismissed it as a trick. One returned, frantic days later, claiming she had seen the house in a dream, its door open, its halls echoing her name. "I didn't go in," she whispered. "Was that wrong?" The playwright only handed her a stone, smooth, black, and warm to the touch. "It remembers enough," he said, "so you don't have to." The stories multiplied, fractaled, refracted. They could not be contained. Scholars of the uncanny dubbed it the Harrowick phenomenon. Some called it mass psychogenic memory. Others believed it a slow infection of narrative itself, a parasitic story that wove itself into the fabric of language, time, and identity. But none could trace its origin. None, except the woman who no longer used her name, who walked without history, who once stood beneath the bell and refused to speak it into being. Calla knew it had never truly been about sound. The bell's power lay not in its toll, but in the need to respond, to name, to bind. She had denied it that, and so it changed. Now she listened, not for the bell, but for its silences, for the pauses between lives, for the places where stories threatened to collapse into repetition. It was there, in that liminal hush, that she did her work, planting, tending, waiting. And somewhere, deep beneath a library that no longer remembers how it was built, a tree grows in a room with no door. Its leaves whisper even when no wind stirs, and at its base, a journal lies sealed in wax, untitled, blank, waiting for the one who can write, not to trap, but to tell. There is a manuscript bound in human silence. It has no title, no table of contents. Its chapters are arranged by absence, its margins inked with things that could not be said at the time, or perhaps ever. No one knows who first began writing it. Perhaps no one did. Perhaps it has always existed, scattered, half-remembered in the corners of letters, in unfinished confessions, in the names of children who vanished, and the lullabies mothers can't quite remember singing. Some say the manuscript is the house, others say it's the bell, but most who study it agree the manuscript is changing. New pages appear where there were none. Symbols reconfigure. Entire paragraphs unwrite themselves. But more unsettling than its evolution is its awareness. The manuscript seems to know the reader, and not simply that they are reading, but how. In a candlelit reading room in Dovetail Abbey, a monk sets the manuscript on his desk. He has read it 100 times. Today, it is different. The page reads, "She is not gone, she is not lost, she is walking, and so are you." The monk shuts the book. He does not mark the page. He will not need to. When he returns, it will be there, waiting, watching. On a train speeding through mist-wrapped countryside, a woman in her 40s finds a journal left behind on her seat. She flips through, blank, except for the center page, which reads, "The toll is not a punishment. It is an opening." That night, she dreams of bells suspended in a dark sea, of staircases descending into salt. She wakes with tears on her face and the feeling that she must go somewhere. She just doesn't know where. In Harrowick, which does not exist, a young man lights a candle. He does not remember why he came here. He remembers only the silence and the name someone once whispered in his ear, Calla. There is a bell above him. It has never rung, and yet he can feel the echo in his ribs. He sits, and the manuscript begins again. Meanwhile, in our world, one mapped and measured and named, people continue to report dreams of places they've never seen. They speak in forgotten dialects. They wake with soot on their hands or ink under their nails. Their stories begin to bend. Their memories rearrange. Some of them find this episode. Some of them are you. And to you, dear listener, this is your moment to choose. The bell has not rung, but you've heard its shape. You've read its story. And now, it waits. Do you return to your life? Or do you start writing? There is no bell. There never was. Only the need to listen, and the promise that someone is listening back. And if the house calls to you again, in silence or in sleep, remember, it never asked you to speak, only to remember, only to walk, only to begin again. Now, as the ink fades and the candle burns low, we close the manuscript once more. But it is not truly closed, is it? It never was. Thank you for joining us on this literary descent into shadows and whispers. This concludes tonight's journey into classic literature and Gothic tales. Until next time, keep your lantern lit and your mind open. You've been listening to Midnight Broadcast.